In the last video I showed you what layouts are, but just as some mock-ups and images on the screen. So in this video we're going to see them in action. I have here our Hello World application from before, which as you might remember uses the vertical box layout. But just to remind ourselves, let's run the application. And you can see that the elements are aligned in a vertical order. We have our Q label at the top, our Q line edit in the middle, and finally our Q push button at the bottom. Now if I were to only change this letter V to a letter H, I would make this a horizontal box layout. Let's run the application. We still have the same elements as you might suspect, but this time they're aligned horizontally. We have our Q label on the left, our Q line edit in the middle, and our Q push button on the right. Similarly, we can make a Q grid layout as well. But this is going to require some setting up. We're namely going to instruct our layout what elements we want to display in what row and column. Or in other words, to simplify, we want to tell the grid layout where we want our elements positioned within that grid. Now, the rows and columns in the grid layout are zero-based, so if I wanted our label here to be in the first row and the first column, I would say comma 0, comma 0. This second parameter, but the first 0, denotes the row, and this third parameter, but the second 0, denotes the column. I want our line edit to be next to the Q label, meaning in the same row, but in the second column. So I'll just add 0 for the row number 1, and I'll add 1 here for the column number 2. As you may imagine, this works kind of like the same as a list in Python. The 0 index is the first element in the list. Finally, I want our Q push button to be to the bottom right of the screen. That means we want it to be in the second column and the second row as well. So I'll just say comma 1, comma 1. Let's run the application, and voila, it's grid aligned. We have our Q label to the left in our first row and first column. We have our Q line edit in the first row but the second column. And finally our Q push button in the second row and in the second column as well. I also promised you in the last video that I'll demonstrate the usefulness of the layouts as well. Looking at the code here, you're probably wondering why our layouts are cluttering it. I mean, for every widget that we want to display on the screen, we have to call this add widget on our layout. This seems very silly and redundant and definitely not Pythonic. Well, there are some tools that will help us automatically manage our layouts so that we don't have to care about them almost at all, but that's slightly more advanced and they'll be in the part 2 of this course. For now, I'm just going to demonstrate the usefulness of the layouts. I have here the application that looks the same as our Hello World application, but don't be deceived. Behind the scenes, there's a slightly different code. The difference being that in this application on the screen, I have no layouts defined. And as you can see here, I have exited from our Hello World application. Now, watch what happens when I resize this application. Remember, this one does not have any layouts defined. If I increase its size, or modify it, or do anything with it, you can see that the resize has no effect on the UI elements whatsoever. In fact, let me make this smaller, and you can see that the UI elements are clipped. This is definitely not something you want your user to experience as well. Now I'm going to close this application and run our application with the QGrid layout, and watch what happens when I resize this one. You can see that the elements are kind of reflowing and realigning themselves. In other words, they're obeying the resize events that fires when we resize our window. Now if I want to make this one smaller than the elements themselves, watch what happens. I can't make it any smaller than the QGrid layout tells me to. Qt is smart enough to figure out, okay, this is really the smallest you want to go. So this may seem like an insignificant problem, but it's not. Trust me. You're listening to someone who has made the same mistake before. I completely thought of layouts as irrelevant. Long story short, I spent days refactoring the code so that I can add layouts to it. Moral of the story is, use layouts. They're your friends. Well, the moment is here. Now there's nothing stopping us from creating our first real application, and this is what we're going to do in our next module.